Thanks so much for joining us here on Atlanta News First Plus. Would just like to share with you some of the top stories that we're following at this hour. Sandy Springs' mom has waived her first appearance in court. She was due to face a judge this morning, accused of murdering her 1-year-old daughter. Nirvana Oliver was found dead last week in a retention pond near an office complex in Sandy Springs. And police were actually called out to that office complex at Peachtree Dunwoody Road and Concourse Parkway on May 11th. They pulled the body of 1-year-old Nirvana Oliver out of the retention pond. Arrest warrants say Asia Lewis, Nirvana's mom, could be seen escorting the child to the pond and then minutes later walking back toward the parking decks by herself. We've also learned that Sandy Springs police were called out for a welfare check just a day before Nirvana was found murdered. Police talked about how deeply this case has affected them. And joining us this afternoon here on Atlanta News First Plus, we have a very special guest joining us. We have retired Senior Sergeant Charles Yarbaugh. You have decades of law enforcement experience. Really appreciate you being here with us. It's remarkable, Mr. Yarbaugh, to hear law enforcement talk about how it has affected them. Did that ever personally affect you, cases like this?
Yes, absolutely. First, condolences to the family and unfortunately the death of that small child. And unfortunately in these type of situations, the mothers, if there's any other pre-knowledge of anything in regards to hurting the child or anything where there may be some mental issues that are going on, these are unfortunately type of situations that happen. And yes, it can affect law enforcement dealing with the death of a child. I just hope and pray that the mother gets the attention that she deserves in regards to mental health. And unfortunately, as far as the child is concerned, her death definitely affects everybody, and as well as members of law enforcement.
So very interesting to note that, there was a welfare check done by Sandy Springs Police just a day before this all happened. What does that say? What kind of insight can you share just based on that particular detail?
Well, one of the things, it's very difficult for law enforcement and as well as the courts to take a child away from a parent. And the welfare check was based on the information they previously had. And they go check on the child, check on the home, make sure everything is fine. And once there's no signs of anything that potentially could be an issue with the child or any hazards, law enforcement has to leave. And unfortunately, the child is then left back up with the parent. And again, as I mentioned, it's very difficult for the courts as well as law enforcement to take a child away from a parent. And unfortunately, this is one of these situations that tragically occurred.
Yeah, it really is such a tragedy. And now this mother is facing a felony murder charge in addition to several other charges. But the Fulton County District Attorney in this case is actually recommending the more serious charge of malice murder. Do you, I know you're a law enforcement expert, you're not, a prosecutor, but even so, just based on what you know about the case, do you think that the charges are appropriate?
Well, it depends. There may have been some previous knowledge about some things that the district attorney has that we are not privileged to. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, in this situation, the bottom line about it is that the death of the child is what's most important. And of course, the mother getting whatever help that she needs. And hopefully this will also let other mothers know that there is a way of getting help and hopefully get them to situations where they can be more conscious and taking care of their children as well.
It sounds like you believe that many times when we do see crimes like this, it sounds like you're saying a mother against a child, that there could be maybe a mental health link there?
Absolutely, yes. And that's another thing that has to be taken into consideration. Mothers go through a lot, dealing with bringing a child into this world. And unfortunately, sometimes that mental health may be overlooked, and there are ways of getting them some assistance and help. And I hope and pray that this happens with more attention being brought to this subject.
Absolutely. I want to shift gears and talk about one of the other lead stories that we're following right now, and that is former Clayton County Sheriff Victor Hill reporting to prison to start his 18-month sentence today. Hill was convicted of violating the rights of inmates in October of 2022, as we've been reporting to our viewers here on Atlanta News First and Atlanta News First Plus. Officials say several inmates reported that Hill had kept them strapped in restraint chairs for hours, even though they were not resisting. A jury found his actions had, quote, no legitimate, non-punitive governmental purpose and violated the inmates' civil rights. His legal team tried to get him out on bond pending his appeal. The judge denied that request, and they are appealing this decision as well. You and I talked about this a little bit last week, Mr. Yarbaugh. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on this case now that he's actually headed to prison?
Well, unfortunately, and one of the things that comes about in regards to law enforcement being an official, that you take an oath, and your oath is to serve the public and make sure that everyone is treated fairly. And unfortunately, in this situation, based on the information that we do have and the fact that he was convicted in court in regards to the treatment of these prisoners, it's an unfortunate situation, and hope it brings more notice of law enforcement as well as to the correctional department about treating people fairly, regardless of what they have done. And I hope and pray that this situation works out in the favor that more attention has been brought to this. And in regards to Victor Hill, one of the things that because he is in charge and overall responsible, he's going to be held to a higher standard.
Now that he is actually reporting to prison, do you think it sends a message to other folks in the law enforcement community?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. And that's another thing that this case has brought to attention is that, you know, regardless of who you are, where you may be, especially as it relates to law enforcement, you're not above the law, and people have to be treated fairly regardless of what crimes they have committed. And this will bring more attention, and some of the policies and procedures at the jail will change, as well as throughout the United States.
Now, I want to ask you, because often when we do see law enforcement, officers and so forth in prison, high-profile individuals in prison, we also see, he's just reporting this will be his first day, but down the line, I wonder if we could potentially see some security issues, because we have seen in the past that high-profile individuals, particularly law enforcement, can be targets for attacks in prison. Is that something that would be on your mind at all in this case?
Well, absolutely. I'm quite sure that Mr. Hill's attorneys will have brought that to the attention of the institution at which he's going to be incarcerated with. And there are times when law enforcement officers get not necessarily special attention, but they put in a position where that they have limited access with inmates, and of course they're in protective custody. And I hope that that's something that they will allow Mr. Hill to have.
And what sort of kind of conditions or restrictions might we be looking at in this case, do you think?
Well, normally they will allow him to either have his food brought to him or put him in a position where that will have security around him where he could eat, and different places that he'll be able to go, exercise, and then maybe go into the library to read or whatever the case may be, and also having access to his attorneys. So they'll be providing additional security measures for him to keep him safe as possible.
And how would this impact the future of, could he potentially down the line go back to a position in law enforcement? How does it work in the law enforcement community?
Well, it depends. One of the things that once his attorneys have set up the appeal, and if he goes back to court and that there's a possibility that this situation could be overturned, then of course everyone deserves a second chance, and there's a possibility he could actually be back into law enforcement. Nothing is for sure, but this is something that potentially could happen for him.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's a case I know that we're going to continue to follow. Do you think he has a chance on appeal?
Absolutely, he does have a chance on appeal, and that's maybe some information that we're not privileged to at this time. And his attorneys will bring that to the court, and of course the judge will make a decision, and then they'll go forward with the case if necessary.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to turn our attention now to another major story that we are following as well. So the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has now identified the remains of this woman, this Georgia woman, and they're now, her husband is now charged with killing her. He's 40 years old, and he was actually arrested in Pennsylvania on Friday, facing multiple charges in connection to the death of his wife. This is all according to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. So they're saying that Nicholas James Casadas is facing malice murder, tampering evidence, removal of body parts from the scene of death. Those are some of the charges. His wife, Mindy, whose picture that you see here, Casadas, she was identified May 11th, according to GBI. And they're saying that, quote, the Casadas were living in Savannah at the time of Mindy's death, and the remains of Mindy were actually found by hunters in the woods near the Portal Hunting Club on Jones Road in December of 2022, December 22nd. This is one of the top stories on our website, as you can see, if our viewers want to check that out. So where these woods are located, it's near the city of Riceboro and Liberty and McIntosh County border, according to GBI. GBI says they conducted multiple interviews, including with Mindy's family. They obtained DNA swabs. Sounds like a very intense and thorough investigation. So FBI Atlanta, FBI Baltimore, U.S. Marshal Service, East Pennsylvania Fugitive Task Force, Lancaster office, several other law enforcement agencies all helped to identify the victim, according to GBI, and ultimately, arrest the suspect, being her husband. So he's now being held at the Lancaster County Prison in Pennsylvania, set to be extradited back here to GBI. Back here to Georgia, I should say, that according to the GBI, I apologize for that misstatement. But there's certainly a lot involved here in the investigation. It's a multi-state operation here. How detailed do you think? How much more detail are we going to see investigators get?
Well, one of the things, first and foremost, condolences to the family in the death of their loved one. And unfortunately, in these type of cases, you hear about this all the time, wherein that one parent, one loved one, or whatever, unfortunately murders another for whatever the reasons are, and of course, none of which could be justified. So, of course, with the investigation that's going on, they're going to get all the information that they have, all the evidence, and present it in the court. And of course, he's going to have opportunity to be represented by an attorney, and they're going to bring the evidence in. And these type of cases, some that are very unfortunate, but the reality of it is that it does happen quite frequently. And whatever the court decides in this situation is going to be based on the evidence, and then, of course, he's going to be put into a situation where he's going to trial.
Yeah, absolutely. In these sorts of instances, first of all, let me ask you, in your experience, how common are these kind of spousal sort of crimes? I mean, am I correct in just kind of my understanding that often spouses are looked at as suspects and kind of in the initial stages of investigations?
Well, absolutely. That's one of the first things that law enforcement will do, either be the wife, the husband, or child, or where their whereabouts, when the last time that they saw the loved one, and then all the evidence that potentially could put them as the number one suspect. The most important thing for anyone involved in this is, cooperation with law enforcement, but of course we know that does not always work out as well in these type of unfortunate incidents that have occurred. So yeah, law enforcement will definitely look at the closest person to that loved one that has unfortunately been killed and get all the information pertaining to that, and then present it to the investigators, and then they go forward with the case.
And we've heard from GBI talking about, getting DNA swabs. How much has this sort of science and technology advanced in recent years, and really helped in the quest for justice in these sorts of cases?
Well, one of the things that definitely has brought law enforcement into the future is the evidence of the DNA swabs. They can get it from just about anything. I remember one case where they were able to get it that happened in D.C. off of a pizza. Subject went in and unfortunately killed a family member, ate a piece of pizza and left that, and they were able to get a DNA swab from that, and eventually he was placed under arrest for the murder. So that's the technology that's come, and it's getting better and better in law enforcement. It's not an answer to everything, but it is definitely something that 99% of the time, once they get that DNA swab, that the person or the persons that are involved are the ones that the subject of the investigation.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously it's heartbreaking. Nothing can ever bring back, a loved one, but at least justice is, some sort of peace for the family.
Absolutely, and one of the other things about it is hopefully that they can rest her in peace and give her the rights of a funeral and so forth, and deal with this situation in court. And unfortunately, the other thing about it as well is that the family has to go into court now, possibly listen to everything that went on, and then the judge and the jury will make a decision on what his sentence may or may not be.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, law enforcement expert, retired Senior Sergeant Charles Yarbaugh, for joining us with your analysis on some of these top stories that we've been following. We always appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.